The sins of the fathers rest heavily on the Turks, because some 150 years after the establishment of the first Göktürk Empire of BUMIN and İsteme, the largest steppe empire in history up to that point, their descendants do not live in independence nor in dignity. The once wise Khagans of the Ashina Dynasty were followed by bad Khagans who sold their homeland without hesitation to foreign rulers in order to maintain their own authority. The dynasty broke apart, and although some members in the west and the east did their best to hold the empire together, an era of oppression followed. Some Ashina resisted the occupants by military force. These brave resistance fighters were betrayed by their own relatives who submitted to the Chinese, maintained the oppression of the Turks, and were rewarded with a comfortable life in luxury. But even in the darkest hour, there is always a glimmer of hope. A light that leads the Turks out of the cave into which they have been forced to flee. Someone who is neither corrupt nor an opportunist. A man who submits only to Tengri and in whose name he will lead his people into freedom. That man is Ilterish. Within a short time, he turns his back on the Chinese and gathers all of the oppressed Turkic tribes for a covert uprising. He trades a life of luxury for a life of dignity. Because of his integrity and charisma, the tribes pledge their allegiance to him. With combined strength, the Turks successfully go into battle against the Chinese for the first time in 50 years. Ilterish thus manages to establish the Second Göktürk Empire in 681 AD. The days of these celestial Turks may be long gone. Nevertheless, it is of utmost importance, especially for the people of the modern Turkic republics, to learn and understand their history. After all, only those who know their past can determine their future. The story of the Göktürks is one of expulsion, flight, and spectacular comeback. According to legend, the last survivor of a tribe had been placed in a cave to find protection from the invaders of his hometown and the murderers of his family. This boy was nourished and raised by an adult fused with a she-wolf. The pregnant she-wolf gave birth to 10 children, all half wolf and half human, who also grew into strong men. With the help of a mighty hammer, the 10 men cleared a path through the mountain range in which they had been hidden to the outside and entered the villages around them. Each of them took a wife from the other tribes, and in course of time they multiplied. One of the men took the surname Ashina after the she-wolf who had given birth to him. Both the legend of Ashina and the legend of Ergenekon illustrate the birth of the Ashina family, who later became known as Turk. Their headquarters were in the Altai Mountains. Here lies the heart of ancient Turkic culture. Surrounded by the Sassanid Mountains in the north, the Altai region consists of beautiful landscapes, rivers, lakes, valleys, and green meadows abound. But when the Ashina family grew bigger and more powerful, they left this area because they became rulers of the Göktürk Empire. The Göktürks were a Eurasian nomadic people of late antiquity who had created the transcontinental steppe empire of Eurasia. This means that they ruled over most of the so-called steppe belt from Korea to Ukraine, but did not live in cities themselves, at least not continuously. The term Göktürk means something like heavenly, blue, eastern, and original Turks. All these characteristics apply to the Ashina, the ruling dynasty of the empire. Incidentally, the Chinese called them Ashina. They were a clan of at least 500 families who had fled from Mongolia to the Turfan Basin in ancient times after the collapse of the Xiongnu Hunnic Empire. When a Chinese army invaded their town and devastated the area, they migrated again, arriving in the Altai in northern Central Asia in the 5th century. The tale of Ashina, inspiration for the Turkish wolf hand gesture, tells of this flight in mythical form. But in any case, within the Altai mountain range, the Ashina had been protected from outside invasions. In the course of the following century, they became excellent blacksmiths and very skilled in horse archery. But as a result of their flight, they had become subjects of the powerful Rouran Empire. The Ashina were Turkic as they spoke the Old Turkic language, cultivated Old Turkic traditions, and believed in the god of the Turks, Tengri. At that time, their neighborhood was filled with people from different cultural spheres, but the most prominent was that of the Turkic peoples. Accordingly, the Ashina represented only one of many Turkic tribes. Despite being in the majority, however, the other Turks could not hold their own against the Rouran, whose dynasty was most likely of Mongol origin, albeit influenced by Turkic culture. But suddenly in 552, BUMIN, as fifth-generation Ashina leader, managed to defeat the Rouran ruler and destroy his empire. However, not in a literal sense, as BUMIN took over the administrative structures of the Rouran Khaganate. He appointed himself Khagan, the great king of the steppe, founded the state of the Turk. We call this state Göktürk to distinguish it from the numerous other Turkic states in history. And to the same extent, we call the ruling dynasty Ashina, so as not to confuse it with the she-wolf Ashina. From then on, his family ruled over most of the steppe. His brother Istemir expanded the territory westwards to the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus, integrating the Sogdians into the empire. This merchant nation, in turn, with the help of the Göktürks, extended their trade and influence along the Silk Road to Byzantium, with which the Turks had formed an alliance with against Persia. The Turks invested in the infrastructure of numerous cities along the Silk Road. The Byzantine diplomat Zimarchus noted in his documents that he had seen marble statues in the cities of the Turks that were in no way inferior to Roman art. In the east, BUMIN's son Muhan honored his father's alliance and, with the GÖK Dynasty, attacked the Qi Dynasty that had harbored Rouran refugees, the former enslavers of the Ashina. In addition, the Göktürks formed a secret alliance with the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo to keep China at bay. During this period, some Turkic tribes had also migrated from their heartland, unintentionally extended the influence of Turkic culture into the Caucasus, Afghanistan, and Tibet. It seemed as if BUMIN's successors had cemented the power of the Ashina dynasty, but the Turkic golden era was rapidly coming to an end. Impatient, greedy 7th-generation Turkic princes were incited to fratricide by Chinese agents. The empire was halved into two parts after a devastating civil war. Despite a final sweep by Tong Yabgu and Ilig Khan, the great last kings of the West and East respectively, the entire Göktürk territory was annexed by China between 630 and 657. The new T'ang Dynasty had reunited China after 400 years of turmoil and made real the revenge of their predecessors against barbarian nomads of the north and east. Thousands of Ashina Turks was forcibly resettled in northern China, while the other Turkic peoples came under Chinese rule in so-called protectorates. Numerous Turkic rebellions failed, including that of a certain Khorshad, who had almost managed to personally assassinate Tang Emperor Taizong. After the conquest of Central Asia, Taizong, the second emperor of the T'ang Dynasty, had ordered the resettlement of the Ashina Turks to northern China. Taizong, whose personal name was Li Shimin, had resorted to two ingenious strategies against the Göktürks. First, ally with the far against the near. Although the Göktürk civil war had ended in 603, the rulers in the west and east remained suspicious of one another. Taizong, like some of his predecessors, drew the Western Turks closer to China through political, dynastic marriage and economic relations in order to ward off attacks from the Eastern Turks. After the invasion of Ilik Khan in the 620s, however, and after Taizong's coup against his own father, the new emperor ordered a new foreign policy against the Göktürks. He now allied himself with other Turkic groups such as the Dokuz Oğuz, who later became known as the Uyghurs and the Si Tardush. The latter helped Taizong overthrow Ilik Khan, and as successors ruled over the former Eastern Empire of the Göktürks on friendly terms with the Chinese, of course. When the Sir Tardush became too powerful, Taizong's armies took up arms and subjugated all of Mongolia. But while still at war with the Sir Tardush, the Chinese also attacked the Tarim Basin, and with it the most important Silk Road trading cities, which until then had been under Göktürk protection. Taizong's plan was particularly perfidious. He used former Göktürk princes that had been resettled from Mongolia to China as generals of the Chinese army. The Western Turks, who were still politically independent, therefore fought several battles of their own relatives from the east for control of the Tarim Basin by the Chinese. After the T'ang Dynasty had subjugated both the Sir Tardush and the Tarim Basin, Chinese armies attacked the Western Turks and advanced as far as Talas in present-day Kyrgyzstan. And so, by 657, the Göktürks were in complete political captivity of the Chinese. But this captivity is to be understood literally, because Taizong's second strategy was even more important than the first: divide and rule. Due to the geographic dispersion of the Ashina Dynasty all over Eurasia, the Göktürks could not organize for large-scale rebellion. Moreover, there was little contact between the Ashina Turks in northern China and the other Turkic ruling dynasties. In the meantime, the Turkic families, who had once been minor rulers within Göktürk dominion, had established their own states. The Turk Shahi, for example, ruled from Kabul to the Pamir Mountains in the east and on the Indus River to the south, while the Tokhara Yabgus ruled the north of what is now Afghanistan, with their HQ being located in Kunduz. The Turks came into strong contact with the Bactrian, Iranian, and Indian cultures, and Manichaeism partly found its way into the court of their rulers. Further west, part of the Ashina dynasty had broken away and founded the states of the Khazars on the Caucasus.
We can begin to speak about the real Khazars, about actual Khazars, sometime in the 640s, 650s. The ethnonym Khazar and Turk is being interchanged, and there's a reason for that. It seems that the Khazars were an offshoot of the Western Turk state, and they were ruled by an Ashina dynasty. Our sources don't say that flat out, but all of the details that the Arabic sources give regarding Khazar customs and ceremonies and so on, like the installation of the Khagan, is identical to the material that the Chinese sources are giving about the GÖK TÜRKS. And we know that the Arabs were not reading Chinese.
Other Turkic-speaking tribes had also founded new kingdoms, such as the Bulgars, ancestors of the Bulgarians, who had been neither Christianized nor Slavicized at this point. But most Turkic tribes, such as the Pecheneg, Kipchaks, Bashkirs, continued to live autonomously in the vastness of the Eurasian Steppe, just as they had before the rise of the Göktürks. The Ashina dynasty in the east was on its own. Taizong had probably been a Turkophile and called himself Tengri Tek Khan of the Turks, meaning legitimized by Tengri. But his successors remained skeptical of the Turks. With each revolt of the Turks, this skepticism increased. Without further ado, the Turkic generals and officers were one by one dismissed by the Tang army, which in turn strengthened the Turks' desire for freedom. They finally wanted to retake control of their own destiny. The Turks' pride was too great for them to allow themselves to be assimilated. Even former Ashina members who had lived in Chinese cities for some time felt increasingly alienated. Attempts by Ashina princes like Inichor Boru and Bengu Shad to declare independence were quickly crushed, and the perpetrators executed by the T'ang Dynasty in the marketplace of Chang'an publicly. Long after Taizong's death, the T'ang Dynasty feared Turkic uprisings and resorted to increasingly brutal methods, and yet the Ashina did not give up.
The Turks in China at this time were a sizable number. They had worked with the Chinese government, the T'ang Dynasty's government, in many military capacities. When foreign groups were brought into China and put into this kind of loose reign system, the reality is that the success of that system really depended on the consent of the people being governed. That is, the T'ang Dynasty did not have a huge army that it could keep up there, control the Turks. They had to rely on their willingness to be part of the system. And in fact, because they were armed people, right? They were at times part of the T'ang military. Eventually, the Turks' leadership decided that they were not benefiting from the system as it was, and they wanted to return to their former way of life. That is, to go back to Mongolia, to the steppe, and to be independent. It perhaps makes sense that the first few failed, in part because it was something new. They weren't sure how to do it. The Chinese did make efforts to stop them. They also made false promises to them. Quit rebelling, we won't punish you. And then they did punish them. For example, Punyan was promised that he wouldn't be punished, and then later he was put to death. They used whatever tricks they could to keep the Turks under control, and that included breaking their promises.
Göktürk, the young nobleman of the Ashina family, dared another uprising. He had been the son of a Tudun, a Turkic governor of the steppe. Göktürk secretly gathered thousands of men and women for a revolt, but instead of heading west like Inichor Boru and Bengu Shad openly towards the old home on the Altai with a temporary headquarters on the flat and open steppe, Göktürk headed east with his army. In the Yin Mountains, the Turks were protected from revenge attacks by the Chinese. Göktürk planned a covert uprising, and for his gathered more local troops, they moved into Shaanxi province. In a total of perhaps a dozen campaigns, he was able to defeat the Chinese with a few exceptions, but his destination was actually the Altai, where the strongest Turkic tribes had dwelled. Göktürk began his campaign in 684 and within 3 years defeated the Dokuzos, the traitors who had overthrown Khagan 5 decades earlier. Then, Göktürk established his rule over the Altai regions. His 17 generals in total moved simultaneously to the north and south to convince the local tribes of Ashina rule. By crossing the Sassanid Mountains victoriously, Göktürk defeated the Kyrgyz Turks and thus secured the entire north of the Eastern Göktürk Empire. At this point, the Chinese no longer had any political or military rule over said region. The new Second Göktürk Empire was born.